Welcome to Thoughts and Theories. In the middle of the dense jungles of Vietnam, beneath the roots of ancient trees and the thick carpet of leaves, there existed another world, a hidden world, a world built not above the ground, but below it, in the dark, humid tunnels that would come to define one of the most unusual wars in human history. These tunnels were not just shelters. They were homes, hospitals, schools, and even entire cities carved into the earth. This was the secret war beneath the war, the tunnel wars of Vietnam. To understand why these tunnels were built, we first need to understand the people who built them, the Vietnamese. For centuries, Vietnam had been invaded and occupied, from the Chinese dynasties to the French Empire, and later the Americans. Yet every invader learned the same painful truth. The Vietnamese never gave up their land easily. They fought with patience, cunning, and endurance. They didn't always have the best weapons, but they had something far more powerful, the will to outlast. When the Vietnam War began in the 1950s and escalated in the 1960s, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong faced a massive enemy, the United States. The Americans had advanced technology, jets, tanks, and bombs that could flatten forests. The Vietnamese had sandals made of tires, rifles from World War II, and the earth itself. That earth would become their strongest weapon. The idea of tunnel warfare was not new in Vietnam. It began during the French occupation in the 1940s when local fighters known as the Viet Minh dug small tunnels to hide from patrols and store weapons. But during the war with America, this idea evolved into something much larger, a network of underground labyrinths stretching hundreds of kilometers. The most famous of these were the Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon. Imagine living underground for weeks or even months. The tunnels were narrow, sometimes only wide enough for one person to crawl through. The air was thick and humid. Bats hung from the ceilings. The deeper levels had tiny rooms where soldiers slept on mats, cooked meals, and even held meetings. Some tunnels had 3 or 4 layers, going as deep as 10 meters. The deeper they went, the safer they were from bombs and artillery. But these tunnels were not only for hiding, they were a weapon of strategy and psychology. The Viet Cong used them to appear and disappear like ghosts. American soldiers called them tunnel rats, because they seemed to come out of nowhere, strike quickly, and vanish underground before anyone could react. For the Americans, it was terrifying. They were trained to fight an enemy they could see, but in Vietnam, the enemy was invisible. The tunnels were connected to trapdoors hidden under leaves or beneath huts. Some had secret underwater entrances through rivers. Inside, there were booby traps, false tunnels, and dead ends to confuse intruders. Some tunnels had kitchens with chimneys that released smoke far away from the actual site, so the enemy couldn't locate them. The Viet Cong even built small air vents disguised as termite mounds to let fresh air in. It was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, born not from luxury or comfort, but from desperation and creativity. The tunnels were not just an engineering marvel. They were a symbol of resistance. American forces knew that these tunnels were a major problem. They tried bombing them, flooding them, even using dogs to sniff out entrances. But the tunnels were too complex. Every time they were destroyed, the Vietnamese rebuilt them, deeper and stronger. At one point, the Americans developed special units called tunnel rats. These were brave volunteers who crawled into the dark passages armed with flashlights and pistols. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Inside, they faced hidden traps, snakes, and sometimes the enemy waiting silently with a knife. Many never came back. But the tunnels were more than military structures. They represented an entire philosophy of war. The Vietnamese did not try to outgun the Americans. They tried to outthink them. They knew they could not win in open combat, so they turned the jungle itself into a weapon. The tunnels allowed them to fight a war of patience. Every battle wasn't about victory in numbers. It was about survival. They waited, observed, and struck only when it mattered. This way of fighting came from a deep understanding of human nature. They understood fear. They understood exhaustion. American soldiers often described how psychologically draining it was to march through the jungle knowing there might be tunnels beneath their feet. Every step could mean an ambush. Every village could hide an entrance. The jungle seemed alive, as if watching them. That uncertainty broke morale faster than bullets. Even more interesting is how the tunnels shaped the culture of the fighters themselves. Life underground required cooperation, silence, and discipline. They couldn't make loud noises. They couldn't use fires freely. They shared food, space, and danger. They became a community built on survival. In many ways, this underground life became a metaphor for the entire Vietnamese spirit, unseen, patient, enduring, yet unbroken. There are stories from veterans who described entire weddings held underground. Babies were born there. Children learned to read and write in dim candlelight while bombs fell above. There were makeshift hospitals where doctors performed surgeries with little more than flashlights and determination. Some tunnels even had conference rooms where commanders planned large-scale attacks. It's almost unbelievable, yet true. What makes this story even more profound is how it reflects the imbalance of power in human conflict. History often celebrates those with the biggest armies or the strongest weapons. But the tunnel wars remind us that human intelligence and resilience can overcome even the mightiest machines. It wasn't technology that saved the Vietnamese. It was adaptability. When American bombers destroyed villages, the Vietnamese didn't surrender. They simply went underground. When soldiers patrolled the forests, the Vietnamese disappeared into the soil. Every attempt to crush them only made them more creative. The Americans measured progress through body counts and destroyed camps. The Vietnamese measured progress by survival, by how many tunnels still stood. Over time, this invisible war began to turn the tide. The Americans could not destroy what they couldn't find. They could control the sky, but not the ground beneath it. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks during the Tet Offensive in 1968, a major turning point that shocked the world and changed the course of the war. But it's important to see the human side too. Life in the tunnels was far from heroic or romantic. It was miserable. There was no sunlight. Food spoiled quickly. People suffered from diseases, insects, and constant fear. Some soldiers lost their sense of time and reality. Imagine being in darkness for weeks, hearing the distant echo of bombs, wondering if you'd ever see daylight again. Survival came at the cost of humanity. Yet, through all this, they held on. And that is perhaps the most fascinating part. How people can endure such conditions when driven by a cause, by the belief that their suffering has meaning. Whether one agrees with their politics or not, it's impossible not to respect the sheer human endurance it took to live underground for years. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels are preserved as a museum. Tourists crawl through widened sections to experience what it was like, but those tunnels are now cleaned, lit, and safe. They can never truly convey what it meant to live down there, to fight a war beneath the earth. The secret tunnel wars of Vietnam reveal more than just military strategy. They reveal a truth about human nature, that when faced with overwhelming power, people don't always fight back with equal force. Sometimes they fight back by disappearing, by adapting, by becoming part of the very environment that was meant to destroy them. It also reminds us of something uncomfortable about war itself, that the most powerful nations in the world can be humbled not by greater weapons, but by greater patience. That intelligence, creativity, and endurance can reshape the outcome of history. The tunnels were a physical space, but also a psychological weapon. They forced the enemy to fight not only an army, but a ghost. In the end, when the war ended in 1975 and the Americans withdrew, the tunnels stood as a silent witness to human determination. They were not just holes in the ground. They were symbols of how far people will go to protect their home, their land, and their identity. Every handful of earth dug by those fighters was a declaration. We may not have much, but we have this ground, and we will not give it up. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the tunnel wars of Vietnam, that history is not always written by the loudest guns or the brightest bombs. Sometimes it's written quietly, underground, in the dark, by those who refuse to be seen, yet refuse to surrender. That was the war beneath the war, a war fought not just with weapons, but with patience, silence, and the earth itself. The secret tunnel wars of Vietnam remain one of the most extraordinary examples of human resilience, proof that even in darkness people can find ways to fight, survive, and endure.